The bells of the ancient church of St. John the Baptist were ringing out over the little town of Halesowen in Worcestershire, calling the faithful to worship on the night of Sunday the 29th of June, 1884, when Francis Brett Young was born. In the south aisle of the parish church, which Brett Young was to describe as our little cathedral, a plaque commemorates the author, whom the town guide names as the most widely known of Halesowen's sons. Jessica Brett Young is seen here with the rector of Halesowen, following the unveiling of the plaque to her late husband in 1966. Here, where his father was once churchwarden, at this spot where people have worshipped God for more than 1,000 years, Francis Brett Young was baptized. He had been born less than half a mile away in Laurel Lane, the eldest child of the town's medical officer of health, Dr. Thomas Brett Young, and his first wife, Annie. Halesowen Magistrates Court now occupies the site where the laurels once stood. The small plaque in the entrance hall recalling the family who once lived here. At the end of the 19th century, the Brett Young's home was one of the largest in the town. In the autumn, the front of the laurels was covered with Virginia creeper, whilst in the summer, sweet-smelling white jasmine clothed the brickwork of the surgery. Climbing roses scrambled over wire arches in the garden, from which came apples, strawberries, red and black currants, gooseberries, and the parsnips which the Brett Young's cook turned into wine. To the right of the front door was the drawing room, with its Bechstein piano, numerous ornaments and pictures. A long passage led to the surgery, with 2 waiting rooms for private and public patients, the dispensary and the doctor's consulting room, connected by a speaking tube to the main bedroom on the first floor. From the laurels, it was a comparatively short cycle ride to the Clent Hills, which were to be of such importance to Francis Brett Young. In a letter of January 1935, he explains just what that importance was.
Southeast of us lay the Clents. From the summits of Clent and Walton, which I called Pen Beacon and Uffdown, I could see all my literary territory. Wychbury is more or less Clent village, and Stout and Stourbridge. Some details are terribly indefinite. Wensford, for example, is a composite black country town, and Wolverbury is not quite Wolverhampton. North Bromwich is Birmingham, and Halesby, of course, is my own birthplace, Halesowen. My territory is really a dream landscape, absorbed and pondered in boyhood from the gorsy summit of Walton Hill. Nothing that has happened in my English books took place outside the limits of that superb vista. Those little hills were the centre of my life and always will be.
From this gorsy summit, Brett Young describes the spread of the Black Country through the eyes of Jasper Mortimer, a character in White Ladies.
Nightfall found Jasper Mortimer on the crown of the Clents, that range of hills that divides the green lands from the black. Immediately at his feet lay dense oak woods, a gulf of darkness. But beyond that dark zone, mounting into the sky, there appeared a spectacle of infernal majesty, all the furnace towers of the Black Country massed in fiery eruption. Those nocturnal splendours have faded now, but in the mid-19th century, the best part of 500 blast furnaces pointed their open throats to heaven like black howitzers. Every muzzle, white hot at the lip, they poured forth their streaming torrents of flame. When one group faded to flickers of summer lightning, another broke forth, suddenly born in the darkness, like a masked battery opening fire. Beneath the high turmoil of this celestial bombardment, like a sea of molten metal, the sanded beds of 1,000 puddling furnaces swam with a more tawny light. The whole of that sunken amphitheatre, 20 miles wide, resembled nothing so much as a seething crater in which the dust and substance of earth were being reduced to a flux of red-hot lava.
Brett Young's English books, sometimes called his Mercian novels, cover a wide time span, from the early 19th century up to the period immediately before the outbreak of the Second World War. The web which together they weave creates something of a saga of life throughout this period of rapid change, in which characters constantly reappear in various novels, taking the reader from one level of society to another, as the panorama of human destiny is revealed within the Black Country landscape. Mr. Ingleby, whose chemist's shop is a feature of Halesby in the early years of the 20th century, appears both in The Young Physician and in My Brother Jonathan, popularised as a television series in the 1980s. Jonathan's father is a patient of Dr. Verdon in Wistanslow, Brett Young's last and unfinished novel about a great house on the edge of the Black Country. Jonathan himself, who completes his medical training in the book which bears his name, is called out to assist in an emergency in Dr. Bradley Remembers, in which John Bradley, on the eve of his retirement, recalls a career which, in length and period, parallels that of the author's father, Dr. Thomas Brett Young. A similar emergency service to that of Jonathan Dacres is fulfilled by Dr. Altrincham Harris, with whom Edwin Ingleby had worked in The Young Physician, in the later novel, Mr. and Mrs. Pennington, which explores the fortunes of a young couple in semi-detached suburbia. Owen Lupton, the hero of Mr. Lupton's Freedom, meets his wife at Morn Hall, at a dance given by Walter Willis, one of the new industrial rich of the Iron Age. Mr. Lupton, whose longing to abandon the commercial rat race for the peace of the countryside remains topical, drives a grey Pierce Tregarron, designed by his millionaire acquaintance, Sir Robert Tregarron, who first appears as the impoverished outcast son of the family in The House Under the Water, a novel which, like Far Forest and The Black Diamond, moves in and out of the Black Country and into the green which lies to the west. David Wilden, of Far Forest, works in the same great Morn colliery as Abner Fellows of The Black Diamond. Abner's dog, Tiger, is shot by Farmer Cookson, who also appears in This Little World, where the story of the decline of the old landowning families of the Shires is told. Dudley and Ernest Wilburn, the North Bromwich solicitors who act for Dr. Weir and his family in Brett Young's prize-winning novel, Portrait of Clare, also act for the Tinsleys in White Ladies, in which the dynastic development of one of the Black Country's great industrial concerns is traced. It is in White Ladies that Brett Young takes his readers to Bromsgrove, which he calls Bromsbarrow, for a picture of the nail-making industry.
By trade, Mr. Small was a nail master, having inherited a small business and a warehouse on the edge of the market town of Bromsbarrow, from which he supplied the nailers of the neighbouring villages with rod iron, out of which, at their domestic forges, they stamped and hammered into shape the wrought iron nails that were still largely used to fix horseshoes. Though this trade was decreasing, all the little red cottages adjoining the warehouse were fitted with lean-to nail houses, so that from the first Bella Tinsley's ears were accustomed to metallic noises. The clank of bundles of rod iron driven up to the yard on flat carts and wheeled away in barrows, the tinkle of musical anvils, and the click of the nailers' hammers. Having a look round with her grandfather was one of the greatest treats of her childhood. She went everywhere with him, into the dim store where the 60-pound sheaves of rusty rod were piled and weighed and distributed. Some of them came, no doubt, from Hayseach. into the office upstairs, where her grandfather kept leather-backed ledgers spread out on high desks and interviewed buyers, into the warehouse, where the finished iron was reweighed and nails stored in sacks, through the yard, a fascinating jumble of rusty scrap metal, into the nail houses, smelling of iron, where aged men talked as they worked, while the coals on the hearth glowed red as the bellows wheezed.
Though nail-making was the traditional trade of his hometown, Francis Brett Young obviously decided he would like to cast his net somewhat wider. In the notebook in which his preparations for Far Forest were made, a page of facts and figures concerning the history of nailing is followed by the plaintive comment, "To hell with nails, try chains," and indeed it was to chains that he turned his attention next.
At Mornheath, the word work had only one meaning, the making of chains. The bulk of the industry, which turned out in a week as much as 1,000 tons of hand-forged chains of every description, from 4-inch mooring cables to dog leads, was housed in sheds holding 5 or 6 workers, usually women, and generally owned by a fogger or middleman, who supplied not only the 9-foot rods from which chains were made, but also the fuel for the fires of breeze and the draught that fanned them. The process of chain making was not very complicated. First, the ends of the iron rods were plunged in the gleed and breathed upon by the bellows until they were red hot. Next, the metal, softened by heat, was bent into the shape of a loop, and the loop detached by cutting on an anvil or hardie. Then the link, still red hot, was twisted with pincers to an incomplete figure of 8, and one end of the figure inserted into the link last forged. Then, finally, the ends were brought together and welded by strokes of the heavy Oliver, a hammer of 36 pounds weight propelled by a treadle. The labours of the female chain makers were an abominable form of slavery, with unending monotony, degrading conditions, continuous discomfort, unlimited hours, and a lamentable scale of payment. Though it was hard enough in all conscience, the sheer weight of the recoil of an Oliver cutting cold iron was enough to jerk a tired woman off her feet. Most of the workers were used to it, and did not appear to resent it. But for their skirts and aprons of spark-singed sacking, no casual observer would have taken these bedraggled figures, who swung their 3-pound hammers and twisted the red-hot rods and stamped on the Oliver, for women. They wore men's caps on their heads and men's boots on their feet. Their arms and shoulders were muscled for manly labour, their movements uncouth, their voices were raucous, their speech embroidered with an unwomanly foulness. Still, life here was no harder than that of hundreds of other women chain-makers.
To complete the industrial trilogy with which Brett Young was familiar comes an account of the harshness of life in a coal mine, described in a number of novels, but here also taken from Far Forest.
In the Great Mourne Colliery, they worked by naked candlelight. The whole atmosphere was hot with the earth's central fires and the warm effluvium of miners' bodies. Sometimes they must swing their picks lying on their sides or their backs in the dust, the ledges within inches of their squinting eyes. Sometimes crouched in angular corners. Later on, with an infinite relief, they might stagger to their feet, stretch their backs, and wield their weapons with a clear space below and behind. Yet however they toiled, there seemed no end to their labour, since the mass their puny muscles and steel attacked was nothing less than the solid earth. Every riven block, every fragment of useless spoil must be rolled, heaved, or shovelled into iron trolley tubs, and these, in their turn, must be hauled or pushed to the bolt hole, whence the patient blind ponies dragged them away down the galleries to the pit eye at the bottom of the shaft. where those carrying coal and spoil were sorted and shunted and hoisted, and finally shot out and dispersed into a light which had not visited them since the crust of the earth cooled. The menace of falling rock was in all men's minds, and the peril of fire damp magnified. These were definite dangers and ills, but perhaps even more unnerving, for such as had nerves, was not merely the darkness, but the mind's lonely emptiness. Amid the vast rumbles and echoes that haunted its silence, a sense not so much of oppression as of segregation, of being cut off from the beauty for which the soul yearned.
There is little beauty in the life of a chain-making or coal-mining town. Indeed, almost the only man-made relief on this otherwise disfigured landscape is the church. In this case, the church where Francis Brett Young was baptised.
I always enjoyed the morning service at Halesby. Its great church was the most romantic feature in all our landscape. Our little cathedral impressed me both by its size and by the grandeur of the aspiration which had made its spire pierce the sky and launched the nave's Gothic arches into the vault. The air which one breathed within it resembled no other. It even smelt different, its odours being compounded of dank, slowly crumbling stone, dust, worm-eaten wood, and mouldy books of devotion. Nor was colour lacking, for when silvery light flooded the clerestory, or sun shone through the 16th century glass of aisles and chancel, the dust-laden air was shot with a rainbow brilliance of ruby and topaz, sapphire and cobalt, which dyed the grey stones beneath which the builders slept. And when the organ played, imposing a reverent stillness on the hushed air, huge waves of sound went rolling away into the remotest recesses of that echoing, complicated cavern of stone, making the benches beneath us tremble with slow reverberations, or released like birds into the dizzy vault, seemed to hover there, suspended in bodiless flight, as though they had reached some celestial region which they were loath to leave until their last vibrations were spent. In a small community such as ours, there was in those days no other place or occasion of general assembly, no theatre or concert hall, and the cinema had not yet been invented. Thus the church became a stage on which once a week, in a superb Gothic setting, the tragi-comedy of life was enacted. In this masquerade there were often moments of incongruity, as when in the choir's solemn procession I recognized the mischievous eyes of the butcher's boy, who on weekdays, in a blue-striped apron, frequently failed to deliver the meat. Others, too, of comic relief, as when Mr. Bazley the organist trod on every pedal within reach to represent the lions roaring after their prey in the Psalms.
Halesby itself is variously described by Brett Young's characters. For the novelist himself, it is the source of much of his inspiration.
Halesowen was given over to the manufacture of hand-wrought nails. Each cottage, and I frequented dozens, had its own little nail house built onto it. There were coal mines, some like Fatherless Bairn, which stands north of Wassell Grove, the site of Cold Harbour, on a prominent ridge. There was also the great integrated concern, handling coal, iron, bricks, forgings, etc., called the New British Iron Works, of which my step-grandfather was managing director. This enormous concern crashed when I was a boy. It owned the Horn Colliery, Great Morn, and Old Horn Hall, Morn Hall, where my step-grandfather lived in state.
For Richard Verdon and Edwin Ingleby, the two characters from the whole canon whose stories are closest to autobiographical, the key word to describe Halesby appears to be sordid.
We dropped down into the valley of the Stour, and the empty streets of Halesby, which in my childhood had seemed a most romantic place, but now appeared a sordid, mean little town. Even the church seemed strangely shrunken. At the corner of the street hung the familiar odour of stale spirits and beer that issued from between the closed doors of the public house, behind which it had been secreted ever since an uproarious closing time the night before. Then came the steep High Street, and from its gutters the indescribable smell of vegetable refuse left there overnight from the greengrocer's stalls. On an ordinary morning it would not have been noticed, for the motion of wheeled traffic in the highway and the sight of open shop windows would have distracted the attention. On Sunday morning, however, it became the most important thing in the road, and seemed to emphasize the deadness of the day, in contrast to the activities and dissipations of Saturday night. It called attention to the sordidness of the whole street, the poverty of its grimy brick, the faded lettering above the shop windows, the paint that cracked and peeled from the closed shutters. On this morning, Halesby was a squalid and degraded little town. Even Mr. Ingleby's shop in the High Street looked curiously small and mean.
However, the town had not always been such a mean little place, and it is amazing how refreshing a shower of rain may be.
The soft rain of the night before had washed from the sky the particles of suspended carbon which gave the Halesby air its characteristic acridity. It was sweet and limpid now, as perhaps it had been in the days before the coal measures were bared, when Halesby had been a clean little market town, and Great Cornbow a cobbled street of brand-new brick houses, with low-silled windows and semicircular fanlights. Even the sordid High Street seemed changed. The shop boys were whistling as they swept clean the pavements in front of their windows, or set out the red and white placards of the morning papers. In the beery draught that ebbed out of the Littleton Arms, the barman was beating a doormat. In the distance, the clock face in the tower of the tall church spire of Halesby, soaring into the blue from its nest of decrepit half-timber, reassured travellers that they would catch their train after all.
Though Francis Brett Young's Black Country is, on the whole, a sordid and a squalid place, the folk who inhabit it, despite the depressing condition of their surroundings, lead heroic lives. Many of his characters are workers with nails or chains, or miners like John Fellows of Hackett's Cottages, who inhabit the poorer quarters of the town.
Number 11 Hackett's Cottages was a four-roomed house of old brickwork that stood in the middle of a row of 21, set diagonally across a patch of wasteland on the outskirts of Halesby. The terrace was 50 years old, and looked older, for the smoke and coal dust of the neighbouring pits had corroded the surface of the bricks, while the crowning in of the earth's crust above the gigantic burrowing of the Great Morn Colliery had loosened the mortar between them, and even produced a series of long cracks that clove the house walls from top to bottom like conventional forked lightning. One of these lines of cleavage split the face of number 11, and ran through the middle of a plaster plaque on which the pious owner of the cottages had carved the words, "Isaiah Hackett, Glory be to God, 1839. This plaque, together with the metal medallion of a fire insurance corporation, and two iron bosses connected with a system of stays by which Mr. Hackett's descendants had tried to save their property from collapsing, made the Fellows' house the most decorative feature of the row. John Fellows, like the rest of the tenants, was a miner. He had chosen to live in Hackett's Cottages because they lay nearer to the colliery than any other buildings in Halesby, and were within a reasonable distance of the crossroads where stood his favourite public house, the Littleton Arms. Hackett's Cottages, in fact, hung poised, as it were, between two magnetic poles, the pit where the money was earned, and the pub where it was spent.
In his survey of the social conditions of the 19th and 20th centuries, Brett Young does not neglect the aristocracy, although they live on the green outer fringes of the Black Country.
Wisthanslow had been built of a honey-coloured Cotswold stone in the mid-18th century. The architect's knowledge of style and proportion, the large number of windows with which he had broken the facade, and the luminosity of the material with which it was built, gave it an air not merely of grace, but of airy elegance. The builder of Wisthanslow had been anxious that his masterpiece should not only be seen to advantage from every side, but also catch every ray of sun that filtered through those cloudy midland skies. It stood in the midst of a level plat of lawn, unbroken save by the narrow gravel drive which encircled it, and only separated from the surrounding park by a sunk fence which did not impede the sweep of the eye as it passed to the low hills fringed with engirdling woodland. The house itself, which when first it was built, and the ashlar unweathered, must have shone out like a casket or lantern of ivory, had become in the passage of years so richly mellowed by sun and shower that the alien stone, first hewn 60 miles away in the Cotswold quarries, seemed as natural to the landscape of its adoption as if it were part of it. There was no dark room in the house. All its windows were tall, the work of an architect who demanded light, not only for its own sake, but also because he knew well how it would illuminate and throw into relief the delicate traceries of plasterwork with which his Italian artificers had embellished both walls and ceilings. The gallery ran the whole length of the house. This room might well have offended the eye by its unusual length and narrowness, but the architect had mastered the problem confronting him by a skilful use of pilasters, which, while serving no structural purpose, broke up the length of the gallery into well-proportioned compartments, and had contrived an illusion of width by introducing a series of mirrors, which gave an effect of space and lightness. The gallery was longer than a cricket pitch, and had been used as a playroom by generations of youthful Foliots, the scars of whose cricket balls John showed me on the bases of the pilasters. For all its riches, Wisthanslow was not a museum. It was a house which had been lived in by 5 or 6 generations, mellowed and worn by continuous habitation. Its beauties did not seem to belong to the past. They were still part of the lives of the people who dwelt in it.
Like this house, Wisthanslow, which enshrined memories of the past, and yet was no museum, but real and vital to the people who lived in it, so the novels of Francis Brett Young are still enjoyed by his present-day readers. The Francis Brett Young Society, with its distinctive emblem of the 3 Worcestershire pears which decorated the Heinemann edition of the writer's books, exists to provide opportunity for those interested in Brett Young's life and work to meet, correspond, and share their enjoyment. Introducing Francis Brett Young, novelist of the Midlands, a teaching and learning pack recently produced by the Society, is an ideal way of providing such opportunities and is used in an increasing number of schools. In addition to the plaques in Halesowen Magistrates Court and Church, recalling Francis Brett Young's birth and baptism, the Society has placed commemorative plaques at Epsom College, where he was educated, and at the house in Harborne Road, Birmingham, where he lodged when a medical student. His career as a doctor and early ventures as a novelist in the little fishing port of Brixham are marked on his 2 homes there, Cleveland House in New Road, near the town centre, and the Old Garden House on Berry Head. The plaque at Esthwaite Lodge, now the Hawkshead Youth Hostel, records that Francis Brett Young lived and worked there from 1929 to 1932. His own hometown recalls its famous son at the Brett Young Day Centre, whilst his 3 careers as physician, poet and novelist are commemorated by the plaque in the north transept of Worcester Cathedral, where his ashes rest. Francis Brett Young was a writer who knew his chosen landscape and its people through and through, and did much to interpret them to a wide audience. Some of his Midland stories deserve a lasting place on the shelf of outstanding 20th century literature. Perhaps the lasting value of his novels is that they bring the past to life in Francis Brett Young's Black Country. I hope that this brief look at his life and works will encourage you to read them, or to reread them, and to judge for yourselves.